Graham Ford is the CEO of Victoria's Farmers Federation. The VFF is the largest state farmer organisation in Australia, representing over 10,000 members who live and work on more than 6,000 farm businesses situated across Victoria. Welcome to you, Graham. We have Cathy McConnell, the Food Alliance Coordinator, Population Health Strategic Research Centre. The Food Alliance is working to achieve a food system that ensures sustainable food security and healthy eating for the Victorian population. Thank you, Cathy. Felicity Milner, Principal Solicitor from the Environment Defenders Office, which is an independent non-for-profit community legal service specialising in public interest environmental law. We also have, so thank you, Felicity, we have Dr. Ron Prestige, the acting Deputy Secretary. You've got a very long title, Ron, I have to say. Agriculture Productivity Department of Environment and Primary Industries here in Victoria, and he's also a Fellow of the Institute of Agricultural Science and Technology. Thank you very much, Ron. And Lisa Kane, who's the Active Living Officer with the Heart Foundation. Lisa works with local government to introduce the principles of food-sensitive planning and urban design and healthy by design. So welcome to you, Lisa, as well. So thanks, a round of applause perhaps for all our panellists for coming here today. Across the sides, yes, very good. Okay, so let's get down to business. Urban development in our cities is replacing productive land. By 2030, it's predicted that half of Victoria's current vegetable growing farmland will have disappeared. So should we be worried? In recent weeks, there have been stories of farmers in the Goulburn Valley wanting assistance to actually pull out their orchards as they can't compete with imported products. Do we simply accept this is a result of market forces? So in the face of climate change, competition for natural resources and international markets, how do we secure our future food supplies? Today, the panel will be taking your questions on the future of food here in Victoria, and I will be rotating around the science. But let's first hear from the panellists. And Cathy, if I can start with you, should we be worried if housing developments replace productive land?
At the moment, it feels like we've got adequate amounts of food.
Just a bit closer, Cathy.
Our supermarket shelves are full. However, research that the Food Alliance has done shows that over 50% of our vegetables are produced within 100 k's of Melbourne, and about 70% of our fruit. So, for the most part, fruit and vegetables are produced very close to where we live. And that's for many reasons. That's because these foods are often perishable, and also it's close to market, so it makes financial sense. So the fact that our population is growing, that's whether that's a good or bad thing, the point is it is, and we do want to both house and feed these people. So what the Food Alliance would be suggesting is that we map where this productive land is, because there isn't very much of it, and then we protect it and find and put housing elsewhere. So across Australia, there's probably only around 46% of our land is arable. Australia is the driest inhabited continent in the world, so there is very little land upon which to grow our produce. So we do see it as an important issue to plan for.
Thanks, Cathy. Now, Graham, the VFF had their annual conference just last week. What was the mood at that conference in terms of the future of food production in the state?
I think there's some concerns around the production in horticulture in particular. Horticulture, because it's a high labour type of production system, is more subject to the competitive pressures around the world. We have some very low production cost countries that are able to import into Australia, so there's lots of competition for them. Our cost of production and our cost of processing as well. So once you get away from the fresh fruit, putting it into some processing framework, our cost of processing is also quite high. It makes it very difficult for our growers to compete in those markets. The Buy Australia campaign, the labelling laws, so they're the issues that are being raised by our members about how do we preserve our production system in those fresh markets. On a broader sense, there's certainly no there'll be any loss of production of food. It's going to be the mix of food that's going to be produced in Australia that'll be changing. There's always been a change in the mix. It's how that mix is shaped up and how farmers are able to remain competitive. The decline in the Australian dollar we've seen recently will be some assistance, but it certainly won't be a panacea to those industries that are really subject to the competitive pressures from overseas countries.
So this forum is titled Food Futures 2020. Are we likely to see, it's not that long ago, to go. It's only 7 years away now, hard to believe. But are we likely to see big changes in farming numbers, do you think, in Victoria in that time?
Victoria in particular, well, farming everywhere is always subject to change. Like any industry, I think the innovators, the people who are the farmers and running businesses are able to gain some competitive advantage or economies of scale. They will continue to grow. There will always be a part of the industry sector that will be dropping off the bottom because they can't compete for a variety of reasons. I think one of the concerns we've got really is about the age of farming and new and enthusiasm coming into the sector, and there's lots of work going for a number of organisations, including ours and Ron's organisation, Debbie, about how we manage that. With the long-term future for food production, we will have considerable amounts of food production in Australia. It's just, as I said, a bit of a mix. In fact, I was just looking at the statistics, and so Melbourne in 1994 was accounting, so the Melbourne statistical area, which is sort of the greater Port Phillip region, was accounting for around 11% of Victoria's valuable food production. In 2007, it actually accounted for 13.6%. Now, which is probably makes sense in that as land prices have got higher, it's only the higher value production systems will actually stay in the proximity to where the land values are increasing. We've seen that the vegetable, and particularly vegetable, there's always been a mobile sector around the urban fringe, because we've got quite a few farmers who used to farm in places like Doncaster. As the urban fringes pushed towards it, they've sold those properties up and moved further out. So we're now at sort of continuing to Casey area. So I think that process will continue on. It doesn't mean that we'll actually lose the production, it will just be shifting. It is, I think, a strategic decision for the state, for the governments to face about, even Victoria, which is probably one of the more benign climates for agriculture compared to some of our northern states, is we have very little land that is both highly productive in fertile soils and has reliable rainfall, and that tends to be where it's also a nice place to live, and that's where the pressure from not just urban development but also that tree change development is occurring.
Well, Ron, if I come to you now, what is the department's view on the future of primary production in the state? What changes do you see by 2020?
Yes, thanks very much. I think we agree very much with the VFF on this. Victoria is an exporting state. Australia is an exporting country. We produce enough food at the global level, at the high level. We produce enough food to feed 60 million people. So a fair chunk of it is actually exported. Around the fringes, around the urban growth, around the cities, I agree with Graham. Again, it's a mobile, fresh food business or industry, and that will move as infrastructure becomes available, water, labour, energy. These seem to be the big issues for agriculture at the moment. It's not availability to land, that's our reading. It is availability to labour, or cheap labour, so they can lower production costs, but also water, infrastructure around transporting produce from farms to ports or to the cities. Those sorts of issues seem to be a bigger issue for Victoria at the moment.
Well, you spoke there rather of environmental issues, and of course the department is recently an amalgamation of primary industries and environment. And I'm wondering, Felicity, from your perspective, is that destined to be a happy marriage, do you think, that combination of primary industries and environment?
I'm not sure. I think it can be. Obviously there are some tensions within that, but I also think that there's a lot more commonalities that people overlook. And obviously in protection for the environment is not just important for it's not just important for the natural environment and the species and so forth, but protection of the environment is also important for people, so that people can do things like grow food and have access to clean and healthy water and land. So I think there is a lot of scope for cooperation, and there are a lot of common issues.
So some of those issues, when you actually hear of about proposals to change land use, more primary production, because the fringe just keeps moving out, for example, from the environment perspective, what kind of things jump into your mind that people need to be thinking about?
Well, climate change is obviously the main one, and I think having food close to market is an important thing for resilience. It means that in terms of other areas around the place having environmental or even political pressures, I think it's important that we do have food that's accessible and close to our market. In terms of just environmental impacts, if food is close to the market, the impacts tend to be less because there's less in terms of required carbon production and in the transporting and getting the food actually to market. I also think that it's an important issue in the context of climate change and also in resource scarcity, particularly water in Australia. It makes sense to be preserving for food production our productive land at the moment that has access to markets and also has access to water. So I think it's important that we think about that urban sprawl issue and how we can limit it and protect our productive land.
We talk about food sensitive planning, but exactly what does that involve?
I guess from the perspective of the Heart Foundation a few years ago with some stakeholders, we produced a resource called Food Sensitive Planning and Urban Design, and the purpose of that document really is to highlight to the professionals that are involved in the built environment the role that food plays in our cities. So from the perspective of the Heart Foundation, it's very much about access to fresh and nutritious foods and making sure that, I guess, the whole food system, right from food production, so the protection of agricultural land, all the way through to how we deal with food waste, I guess is considered and the role of the city that the cities have in that. So that resource is very much targeted to local government and looks at the different documents and plans and programs that local government have at their fingertips to use, I guess, in making sure that we provide, I guess, a sustainable and resilient food system so that our communities do have access to those healthy and nutritious foods.
So you would imagine, though, that the kind of things that, say, the city of Yarra needs to think about in a city, Melbourne, compared to the rural city of Swan Hill, are going to be quite different. So how does the same sort of rules apply?
What we're probably seeing is, I guess, the more rural councils, I guess the kind of issues that they might be looking more at might be things like rural land use studies and things like that, looking at what is grown in their areas, what the pressures for development might be for urban uses in those areas, and looking at protecting agricultural areas. If you're talking more about metropolitan Melbourne councils, then I guess they're probably more looking at the role that urban farms or food has in an urban environment. So looking at the role of fruit trees as street trees, looking at their council bylaws, whether any of those kind of bylaws are prohibitive to people to actually produce food in their own gardens and things like that. So there's distinct differences, I think, that depending on where councils are located as to what might be a priority issue for them.
It's quite a turnaround, isn't it? I think the drought saw the increase in local sort of water tanks, where at one point they were actually banned. You couldn't actually, it was actually illegal. Well, we'll come to questions in Ballarat, Bendigo and Bairnsdale very soon. But Felicity, I just wanted to throw to you this concept of food security, which is the term that you use, which is really what we're talking about here. But how do you really define that? You'll have to grab that microphone again. But from the Alliance perspective, if someone said, what is food security? What are you talking about?
Yes, so food security is when all people have access to healthy, nutritious, culturally appropriate fresh foods at all times to lead a normal, active, healthy lifestyle. So this has become, an issue across the globe, and many people might say that in fact Food Australia is food secure because we do produce enough food to feed 60 million people. However, on average in Victoria, 6% of our population is food insecure, and in some local government areas, up to 20% of people are food insecure. The end of last year, the ACOS, some national data showed that in the households surveyed, 1 in 10 of the households were predicting that their children went without food all day long, regularly. So even though there's enough food, we obviously have problems with distribution and accessing that food. So we do say it is a problem. And so when you look at the different components of food security, one, you need to have an adequate supply, but that in itself isn't enough. You need to be able to have access to that, both financial access and physical access. So you've got to be able to get to it. And then lastly, you need a culture or a demand. So you've got to want it, even though it might be there, you can get to it, you can afford it. There's got to be the societal pressure or acceptability to want to have that food, to want to choose that healthy food. So you need all of those variables to come together to ensure that we are food secure.
Now, Graham, I wonder from the farmer's perspective, do you have a different view on food security, or just, it must be frustrating. I saw those pictures from the Golden Valley of people, fruit basically rotting, rolling over them. We're hearing these statistics of people who can't get enough food.
There's a perception now that food has to be perfect, particularly fruit and vegetable, which probably wasn't 20, 30 years ago. Wasn't the case, that there was accepted that there were some blemishes, or it wasn't a perfectly curved banana and bright yellow or luscious, which may not make that much of a difference to the taste or the quality. So we do see, particularly supermarkets and distribution centres, who are very stringent on their specifications. So anything slightly outside of spec, which might mean it's a perfectly useful and nutritious piece of food, is rejected. Now what happens to that rejected food? Sometimes it will go to waste. Other times you'll have organisations like Oz Harvest who will pick it up and redistribute it. But there certainly is a perception now that if it's not an absolutely perfect piece of fruit in particular, we shouldn't be actually putting it on the supermarket shelves. So that is a concern about, I guess that's an education as well. And again, probably a symptom of the disconnect that we're now seeing between food production and the population. Whereas 30 years ago, most people in an urban environment knew someone on a farm or a relative on a farm, visited the farm, and had a much better understanding of what a farm production system looked like.
Ron, you're nodding there, and I think, am I right in thinking that the Minister's current title is actually the Minister for Agriculture and Food Security? So is this a term that is used a lot within the department?
Yes, you're right. Peter Walsh is the Minister for Agriculture and Food Security and Minister for Water. It is an issue for the department, but I don't think it's a solely agricultural issue. It entails planning. So across government, it picks up a number of different portfolios and responsibilities. For example, government has responsibilities in food in terms of food safety, food labelling, ensuring the biosecurity aspects are fresh and clean. They provide knowledge in terms of extension services and research. In terms of regulation, there's animal welfare and pesticide regulations and all this sort of stuff. So there's a whole suite of services that government does provide. One of the things it's doing at the moment is looking, and it relates to the SPC issue in the northern part of the state, around trees being pulled out and looking for alternative markets. And in this case, the opportunity is is an export-driven opportunity, and capturing the opportunity of a growing population and a growing affluent middle class that's appearing and requiring high levels of protein and fresh produce and those sorts of things. So government is already doing a lot in this space, and a lot of it is to do with helping farmers adjust from what they've been growing to new varieties, and also finding alternative markets for them.
Thank you. Felicity, a healthy environment, is that key to a good food security, do you think?
Absolutely. I think we saw during the drought how vulnerable our food production can be when we haven't got access to water. So making sure, I think that's the most immediate thing. Making sure that we do have flowing rivers and we do have access to groundwater, and that we're not overusing that and overdrawing on it. And we're regulating industries like mining that potentially have a big impact on those resources. Agriculture obviously also has a big impact on those resources. Healthy environment, I think in the future, as I've already said, climate change is going to be the most critical issue in terms of environment and food production. We've seen the international experts on climate change predicting that the southeast of Australia is going to get drier, have more droughts more often. That's not something we can just fix in Victoria, but it's going to be a critical issue for food production in the future.
And Lisa, on this topic, I'll go to one of the questions that came in advance from participants. And I guess, what role does the panel, I'll say Lisa, see in community gardens and home gardens in urban environments addressing this issue of food security?
I definitely do think they do have a role, and I think they're probably maybe becoming a little bit more popular too, particularly community gardens. When we work with local government, that is something that comes up quite often. The local government are approached a lot about the role of community gardens and facilitating community gardens. So I think they definitely do have a role. I don't think though they are the silver bullet, I guess, in the issues of the broader issues that Kathy spoke about earlier about food security and people having access to healthy, nutritious foods. But they definitely do have a role, but I think there are some maintenance issues and risk management issues that local government have concerns about before I guess they can before they go ahead. We see a lot of local governments at the moment sometimes don't even have policies on community gardens, so when they get approached by their communities for wanting these in new developments or existing developments, they don't even really have a policy stance as to how to process that. So there's, I think, some hurdles as well to come over before they kind of become mainstream as well.
And I guess it's very hard to grow wheat and canola sustainably in an urban environment, so there's always those considerations.